about Ailsa Ingalls and the work of the Scottish Women's Hospital already? A little bit. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm not claiming to be the world's expert on it at all, but I have done a lot of research. Love talking about it. It's one of the most interesting stories that I found from the First World War, and strangely enough one that's been largely forgotten in the country of the hospital's birth. So Ailsa Ingalls was no spring chicken by 1914. She was actually born in 1864 in India. Her dad worked for the consulate there, and from the time she was like a young girl, she said, I want to be a doctor. Now at that time, women were not allowed to qualify in medicine. Come on in, guys, please come in, don't get wet, just don't be shy, come on in. Rumour has it that when she was a little girl, she used to paint measles on her dolls and try and cure them. And she said to her father, I want to study medicine. And her father was quite progressive for the day, said, absolutely, go for it. So she was one of the first generation of women, very formidable women, who basically made enough of a pain in the butt of themselves. That the universities eventually accepted them to study medicine, although Edinburgh University at the time, if I remember correctly, did not allow them to sit their final examinations. So Ailsa Ingalls had to come through to Glasgow, which was more progressive. Yeah, West is best. And she did some hospital work through here as well. There were all sorts of barriers put up against female medical students at the time. For example, many universities or hospitals did not allow them to practice on the wards because they were not to mix with male patients at all, or they had to raise a certain amount of money before they were allowed to practice on the wards. So she overcame quite a lot of prejudice in order to get her degree. She worked for a time in London, and she worked basically in the maternity hospitals in quite a deprived area, and she became incensed by social injustice basically, and the fact that women were second-class citizens. She had many women coming in heavily pregnant and in need of an operation, surgical operation, but they could not give consent for their own operation at the time. The husband had to give consent, and in many cases the husband would say, I'm not signing a consent form, I need her at home to look after the other children, and she would get furious about this, not only at the injustice but at the fact that the women were so stupid that they wouldn't, or she perceived them to be so stupid that they wouldn't stand up to their husbands. So when she came back to Edinburgh, she set up a maternity hospital for some of the poorest around the Canongate area of the city, and she became very involved in women's suffrage, the women's suffrage movement. And in 1914, when war broke out, she had a wonderful idea, which I'm sure some of you know about, and that came to be the Scottish Women's Hospitals. They raised the amount of money they needed, which was something like £4,000 within the space of 2 months, to take a unit over to France, the first unit. And the myth is she went to an official at the War Office who said, we have a fully equipped field hospital ready to go, and the official said, my good woman, go home and sit still. Ailsa Ingalls never sat still in her life, but she was a formidable lady, so she went and she contacted the French Red Cross and the Serbians as well, and asked if they would like a unit staffed entirely by women. There were a couple of male drivers within the Scottish Women's Hospital, but the surgeons, the radiographers, the bacteriologists, the doctors, the nurses, the orderlies were mostly all women. Some of them from very affluent backgrounds, because apart from the doctors and the surgeons, they weren't really paid. In fact, they were supposed to pay their own way in many cases. So you had some very eccentric characters in the different units, and some very adventurous souls as well. So the first unit crossed to France in November 1914, and they were given the Abbey of Royaumont to work in. When they arrived there, they found it was partially derelict. It had no electric lighting, it had no running water, and so the first thing they had to do was to set about making it a place that was useful and, used for purpose for the wounded coming in. The French, although they had agreed that the Scottish Women's Hospital could nurse their soldiers, look after their soldiers, were initially quite suspicious of how how well they would actually do. So they sent them sick cases to start with rather than wounded. But eventually they gained the confidence of the French authorities and started functioning very well as a hospital. They expanded the amount of beds they had available until 1918 they had 400 beds in the Abbey. And during the German offensive, in the summer of 1918, June 1918, although they had 400 beds, in June they treated 1,600 soldiers. And in that time, they were having to operate by candlelight a lot of the time at night because there were air raids that were very close to the hospital. They had 2 surgeons that worked around the clock for that month, and they slept in 3-hour shifts. So these women were 3 hours sleep back on duty, 3 hours sleep back on duty. Their radiographer actually did so many x-rays that she gave herself radiation poisoning. Essentially, she scorched her own blood, and although she survived the war, she died prematurely because of what she'd been doing. So Royaumont operated very effectively, and in 1915 they also took a unit over to Serbia. When they arrived in Serbia, they found conditions there very poor. The hospital that they arrived at, there was an outbreak of typhus, and the conditions were incredibly unsanitary. There were holes cut in the ward floor, and that was where people went to the toilet. So they had to set about putting in a proper system to make everything clean and sanitary. They were operating quite effectively, and then of course there was the invasion of Serbia. So the Austrians, the Bulgarians and the Germans from 3 sides invaded the country, and the Scottish Women's Hospital found themselves in the front line. All the Serbian wounded soldiers that they treated were now retreating through where they were, and they were faced with the option either to retreat with the army and the civilians or to stay with the most badly wounded and become prisoners of war. Some of them opted to stay, many of them opted to join the retreat, and it was a retreat that was of several hundred miles across the Montenegrin Albanian mountains in winter. And when they got to one of the tops of the mountain pass, one of the ambulance drivers was actually swept over a cliff and obviously killed. It was a pitiful procession of hundreds of broken people in a country that had been invaded, and many of the women who made it home never really forgot the plight of the Serbian people. Still to this day in Serbia, the Scottish Women's Hospital is absolutely revered. In fact, they're planning a huge commemoration next year. And the man who is the local authority has been invited over there by the Serbian government. The people who stayed to nurse the wounded or tend the wounded, including Ailsa Engels, were prisoners of war for several months. And in that time, the Germans came into their hospital and effectively said, "This is brilliant, we'll have this, thanks." So took the beds, took all their supplies, so they were left to tend their Serbian wounded with virtually nothing. Heard no news from the outside world at all. The thing that made me laugh when I read about this is when they were told they were being repatriated, they were taken to the train under armed guard. Clearly the Scottish Women's Hospital posed a national threat. They were eventually repatriated through Vienna to Scotland, and as soon as Ailsa Engels got back, she said, "Right, well, we've had to pull out of Serbia, let's go to Russia." By that time, she knew she was ill. She wasn't young, she'd worked incredibly hard, and she knew that she probably had cancer. But she took another unit over to Archangel in Russia through submarine-infested waters. She saw her unit up and running there, and it was only when the revolution broke out and they came home again that she allowed herself to rest. And in actual fact, the last telegram she sent was to her niece and said, I'm feeling a little tired, but I shall see you all soon. I'm a little ill, but there's nothing to worry about. Her ship docked at Newcastle and she died the following day, having pretty much broken her health to fulfil her vision, I think, of getting these tremendous units up and running and proving to everyone that women were just as capable of bravery, of physical hardship, of mental endurance than any man in the war. And the Scottish Women's Hospital at the time faced a lot of prejudice from the British Army. They had originally said, we don't want women doctors. They had, when the manpower was running a little low, 2 years into the war, had actually reversed that and said, if you're a woman and you have medical training, you will join the British Army, you will not join the Scottish Women's Hospital because we need you here. So a lot of the women who joined the units actually were ambulance drivers instead of surgeons or doctors, and if they happened to be able to carry out surgical procedures, that was great. But it's a phenomenal story, and it's one it keeps unfolding, because you come across letters, you come across diaries of all these women who went to these far-flung places and did things they probably never dreamed that they would be able to do. And it is something that's not well known about in this country at all. It's a tremendous story, and it's one that we should be very proud of, but one that Scotland seems to have overlooked to a large extent. So we're hoping with the centenary of Ailsa Engle's death next year that the story of the Scottish Women's Hospital comes home, as it were. So thank you very much for your attention this afternoon.